Thank you, Jose Maria. That was a pretty chilling counterpoint to Commissioner Gabriel's opening keynote, and very much, reflecting the ambitions of the Commission on one side and the realities of business on the other. And I think that's what this panel is here to discuss, and also to discuss, about what the objectives are really in terms of network rollout and what we want to achieve from it. So, first of all, I'd like to come to our other speakers just to give us a couple of minutes of their thoughts, really to discuss, whether or not, the industry is at a position now that they can take advantage of some of the technology changes, as well as regulatory changes, which are being proposed from the earlier speech. Rajeev, do you want to start that?
Yeah, I think, first of all, 5G is coming before anybody expected. We would have said a couple of years ago it's 2020-ish, and now we see it in 18 and 19 in other parts of the world. So it's going to start from US and Korea, and then Japan and China and Australia and Middle East and the Nordics, and then the rest of Europe. So I think the opportunity is there, but I agree with Jose Maria that we need a better, predictable, pro-investment climate. And what is the opportunity for 5G, and what do we see from the Korea Olympics and other such cases? I don't think there is a greater opportunity in the consumer business case that will yield, greater ARPUs or revenues. In some parts of Europe, yes, but I don't think mostly that'll be the case around the world. Except maybe live entertainment, virtual reality, augmented reality, and things like these. But the greater opportunities in the industrial business cases, because 5G is going to be this, we call it this general purpose technology, much like the electricity or the internet or the wheel, and it's almost a national infrastructure. And I think the industrial opportunity is gigantic. We think that there could be, between the year of 2028 to 2033, even a very sharp productivity increase in countries coming on the back of this sort of national infrastructure. Second, we think for the operators that there is between, let's say, 10 years from now, so 2018 to 2028, something like a 150% increase in EBITDA potential in the enterprise space, and just the enterprise opportunity being about 150%. So we're talking about 8 to 10% CAGR opportunity in the enterprise space. And where are the opportunities? It's industrial companies. We all talk about driverless cars and so on, but even well before that, there is the industrial companies, logistics, healthcare. Imagine 5G ambulances. Imagine just the whole digitalization of continuous monitoring devices and so on. So logistics, industrials, healthcare, utilities, and so on. So it's a great opportunity. In fact, we think, just from my point of view, that the number of base stations required on the industrial side through network slicing that the operators will provide, intelligent network slicing, digital partition of networks, could be 2x the number of base stations required on the service provider side. So the time is there, but we can't do it with 450 operators. We need to allow in-country consolidation, not just cross-border consolidation. We've got to allow spectrum to be longer times. We've got to figure out how net neutrality can be eased for the industrial use cases, because if there's no slicing, there's no industrial opportunity. My customers here need like 1,000, tens of thousands of slices to be given. It'll be zero touch, it'll be fairly automated, but not if you're going to be sticky around what net neutrality allows and doesn't allow.
Yeah. Börje, when it comes to regulations, where does Ericsson see the potential to change, and what is the prize, I suppose?
Yeah. First of all, thanks, Dan, for the introduction, and thanks to FT ETNO for inviting me. I think it's a very exciting time we live in right now, as we see 5G becoming commercially deployed. It's not a dream anymore. It's actually operational in networks on commercial deployments. But for the first time, it's not led by Europe. I think it's the first G where Europe does not take a leading role. This time, it's led by Northeast Asia, like Rajeev said, but also North America and the United States. But why is this important? Well, we think 5G is more than just another G. It gives a lot more. Of course, it's faster. It's more than 10 times faster. But I think the other benefits are more important. We talk about 10 times lower latency. We talk about 10 times battery life. We talk about the number of connections being 10 to 100 times what a 4G network can give. And of course, the first use case, a little bit, will be for the enhanced mobile broadband. It's just to cope with the cost of the exploding data traffic. Like Jose Maria said, it's doubling every 18 months. The operators just need new technology to cope with that cost pressure that's going to come. First use case. Second is probably fixed wireless access. That's what's happening in North America today. We see other areas increasingly interested in that in order to drive penetration of connectivity to, I would say, rural areas or suburban areas where just fiber deployment isn't economical. But really the key use cases for 5G will be the industrial use cases. That is where we can leverage the latency, the number of connections with mass deployments of sensors, for example. And now that we talk about use cases, it's worth to remember that in 4G, we didn't have a killer app either. Today we know it's mobile broadband, everyone has it, and we take it for granted. It's going to be the same thing with 5G and industrial use cases. I think we will see massive innovation in this area. And as a matter of fact, I believe connectivity enables innovation. And one of the reasons why the North American tech companies have been successful is actually strong 4G networks. Why did some startups come in Sweden? Well, it's actually a strong 4G network available in Sweden very early on. So connectivity is, I would say, a national critical infrastructure for the digital economy. This is well understood in North America. I would say it's well understood in Northeast Asia. And they are trying to race ahead to create a competitive advantage in new industries in leveraging the connectivity over, for example, Europe.
Yeah.
So I just want to end with a couple of us. I think we need healthy operators in Europe that actually have a good investment climate. And it's worth to remember the three biggest markets now in the world: China, 3 operators; India, 3 operators; North America, going from 4 to 3 operators, most likely. We need 5G spectrum in low, mid, and high bands. And we need much longer time periods for license periods. I would say no one would invest in road infrastructure with a 20-year investment horizon. Why are we treating digital infrastructure differently? We need net neutrality rules that actually allow for the functionalities in 5G, for example, network slicing. And lastly, we need to make regulatory changes to allow simplification in site acquisition and site build-out. So I think really it's up to Europe, has a chance to step up now, but don't wait too long.
Yeah, indeed. Cristiano, it must resonate with a lot of what you're seeing as well in terms of take-up internationally compared to Europe. And indeed, 5G doesn't exist at the moment, clearly, but you must be seeing the demand out there.
Yeah, well, good morning, everyone. Actually, pleasure to be here. It's interesting actually looking at the presentation, the dialogue before. 5G is actually one of the single largest opportunity that exists today, I think, for network operators and for this industry. And it's really important to really understand the role of 5G. When, as my friend here mentioned about the conversation in the past, 2G was about everyone getting a phone. Then as we get to what we see today with the smartphone revolution, it was basically everyone having a personal computer and a broadband, and it really changed dramatically, I think, the society today. 5G has a purpose. For the next, decade, it's about the single infrastructure that will provide connectivity not only for the phones that we have today, but replacing every other purpose-built network out there. In a way that we will not talk about the use case anymore. We're not talking about this is just for phones, about assuming that everything will be connected to the internet, connected at high speed, and will solve a lot of those things that I think Jose Maria had presented about the need for data. And the reality is, it will have a profound transformation in the economy, in the digital economy, like 4G and the smartphone was before. There will be a difference between competitive companies and competitive economies with and without 5G. And that's why we see, there's great attention. The technology is ready today. The technology will be getting in the hands of people in early 2019. We see, a global demand. We're very pleased about, I think, the potential that exists for Europe to be in the leadership within 5G with launches early in 2019. And we believe that, the opportunity, as pointed out by Jose Maria, it is real and it's not too late. And I think it's probably one of the best opportunities for mobile operators, as 5G is going to transform not only phones and consumer, but all of the industrial, the private network, and the enterprises. It is going to be the deciding factor about who are going to be the technologist leaders for the next decade. So we're very excited about it. We've been working very hard to make that a reality, and if it depends on Qualcomm, Europe is going to be within the first, continents to launch 5G together with the United States and what's happening in Asia as well.
Well, I think I've counted, thank you very much, first of all. I think I've counted no less than sort of 8 or 9 different 5G networks now live, apparently. But Rajeev, you were in the Winter Olympics. You saw 5G in action, I suppose. What did it look like? Did people even notice?
It was impressive. It was still early days. I mean, sort of remember. But I think we saw, if there's bobsled, and you can actually see it from the athlete's point of view. So I can see it from the athlete's point of view. Time slicing, I could see the sport as a viewer in terms of the angle I wanted to see it, the slices. It's all virtual reality. You could be transported with buses between the different Olympic venues, and you'd get to see it in VR if you had the headset. So real virtual reality, like you're in the stadium. There was public safety application. You could use it with facial recognition technology. There were a number of drones up there that would be able to manage public crowd management and so on, so public safety. So a number of applications. They were all in this live sporting VR type environment. And I think, to Börje's point, it will start with enhanced mobile broadband, because there will be maybe it's 80 to 90% lower cost per bit for production of video, right? And so, of course, this will help. Will it increase revenue? Maybe not, but it'll, of course, reduce the cost. Maybe you can use that with intelligent pricing to increase revenue as well, but I'm not so sure. So the enhanced mobile broadband comes first. Indeed, fixed wireless for mobile operators is a way to compete with cable and other wireline operators if you don't have that proposition. So it's a new revenue opportunity. It clearly is for the ones that don't have it. So Korea was impressive early days. There was no industrial there. So live entertainment, live media, VR, AR. Let's remember also that I think virtual reality, we did this analysis at Nokia Bell Labs, and we said, what could be the big capacity drivers? We know the capacity is, this is 1,000 times more capacity in 5G, so it's lower cost per bit, it's a lot of latency. But let's take the example of US. Across all networks, today the usage is 100 gigabytes per user per month. Not just wireless, across all networks. And we calculated that if VR took 20% penetration globally, or let's say in the US, that number without VR would go to about 4 times by 2025. So let's say 400. But with VR, it could be even 6,000 gigabytes per user per month across these old networks. So VR is a massively exponential driver. It would be a problem if we cannot monetize some of that, because, wow, can you imagine that 6,000 compared to 100 today per user per month? That's a lot. But so therein also lies the problem. That's why you need the massive cost reduction per bit. So Korea was interesting, but I'd say it's still early days. And of course, Korea is in the race with the US right now to launch first. I just came from Korea. I was there last week, and all operators have been told that please don't launch before March 2019. But they're ready, right? And US might actually start to do stuff this year, and there'll be early launches around that same time frame.
Yeah, I guess all three of you are very much involved in supporting the big US carriers and their plans, AT&T and Verizon, talking a lot about 5G now, which is it's interesting. But Jose Maria, to come back to you, I mean, clearly the prize is there. People talk about the data that's needed and all the rest of it. But I mean, what do you need? I mean, you talk about deregulation. So I think we can unpick that a little bit. What do you need as a company? I mean, clearly you can see the demand, but you potentially can't see how to make money out of that demand, I guess is the problem.
Well, that's one of the problems, but we need to do our homework as well. I mean, remember that as we are talking about launching 5G, in most of our countries we have a GSM network, a GPRS network, an H network, UMTS network, an HSPA network, an HSPA Plus network, an LTE Advanced, and now we are talking about launching 5G. So we have too many technologies, I mean, too many roads. I mean, we need to start simplifying ourselves before getting into this cost reduction, because if not, not even the cost part of it is going to be an advantage.
Right.
So there is homework to be done, and on that part, regulation should help, because decommissioning networks, sharing networks that are no longer profitable on a standalone basis, and therefore centralizing some of the networks being used by all the players is a must. But now let's move into 5G. And we tend to have a fragile memory. Remember the UMTS process in Europe in year 2000, 2002. This technology was issued too soon. Spectrum was too expensive. There were no user cases. And it caused Europe to lag behind, because till then, Europe was at the forefront of innovation. Since then, Europe has been lagging behind. Massive write-offs of license a few years later, and that caused the technology to be adopted later than any other parts of the world. So that's my concern around 5G. In order to have a successful deployment of technology, in the case of 5G, you need 5 elements. You need the radio standard, the standardization. It is happening as we speak. I mean, but in some places, this has been launched without the standardization. You need the spectrum, and you'd rather have that spectrum not very expensively, because if not, we'll be running into the same mistakes that were done at the time of the UMTS license. Then you will need tens of thousands of base stations, not just a few thousands, tens of thousands, highly densified networks. We are talking about microcells, femtocells, picocells, so different kind of base station, but tens of thousands of base stations, huge capillarity, densifying the networks. Then you need user cases and handsets. User cases are not as clear, so in terms of monetization of further revenues, doesn't look like, apart from the business segment, is going to be evident or relevant. And then finally, you need fiber to each of those base stations, because without fiber, this huge capacity and low latency of the radio standard can be a bottleneck in terms of transmission, core, or transport. So you need to run in parallel an industrial view of 5G and of fiber, and Europe is just not prepared for that. So my concern is that we are rushing into a technology as the networks are just not prepared. And my concern is that we might be committing the same mistakes that were committed at the time of the UMTS. So I'm a little bit more reluctant to say that this is going to come very, very fast. In my opinion, it should come progressively. It should be a different kind of deployment, jointly with 4G, because we have not been yet been able to extract all the value of 4G. Ideally, to be able to use the same spectrum for different technologies, something that has not been done so far. So being able to use the same spectrum for 4G than for 5G. So I think that there are a lot of elements that need to be put in place before being very optimistic about 5G. I think it's an amazing technology, but we need to deploy it in the right manner, precisely in Europe. I mean,
Yeah, I mean, Cristiano, it's going to some of the areas you just spoke about. Cristiano, in terms of the standardization, where are we on that now? Is there a common agreement about what 5G looks like and what it will do?
Yes, you know, the 3GPP completed the 5G new radio. This was actually late next year, and the first instantiation uses the core of the 4G networks we call known standalone, and it's the absolute majority of the deployments that you'll see in the first half in 2019. The 3GPP also completed the standardization for the standalone mode, which will, you know, starting in the second half 2019, you're going to see that in China as well. Those are two important, I think, modes, because one of the use cases you're going to see on 5G is also a lot of private networks. The same way as the networks get densified, the same way you'll see an enterprise build their own Wi-Fi network, they will be building their own 5G network as well. And the standards has been implemented across the infrastructure, you know, our chipsets and devices, and you'll see a full 3GPP 5G new radio standard launching as early at the March-April timeframe 2019 in commercial handsets.
Which is very soon indeed. And Börje, I mean, the other thing I think Jose Maria touched on is the spectrum policy. and the need for a clearer route into the auction process and so on. I mean, from where you sit, do you think the Commission's come up with a reasonable framework for this, or would you want to see a slightly different approach?
Well, we can just look at the auction in Italy for the spectrum prices there. It's probably the highest in the world. It represents about 2 years of capex, and you control that for 20 years. And sometimes I think we're confused with this, with length of spectrum holding. 20 years, when you get it, can look like a long time. But when you have 2 or 3 years left, it's a very short time. So I think one of the big things that can be done is actually to give or to have a much longer or infinite spectrum holding period. Then you will see many more applications where you, for example, reform spectrum in a different way. For example, there are technologies already today when you can share 4G and 5G spectrum. Makes a lot of sense to do. For example, I mean, 2100, 1800 in Europe would be quite attractive to use. But that requires also the much longer investment horizon for the operator. And that's back to, I think it's more a overall framework where we need to make sure that the operators are healthy in Europe. If healthy operators will also invest in the future, they will believe in the future, and they will take that step. That's what we see in North America. We see that they are investing on their own. It's not mandated by anyone. They're actually saying it's a commercial opportunity to invest in 5G. They do it, for example, first use case, fixed wireless access. It's a revenue opportunity for them.
Well, I thought it was interesting that, because there's been a bit of talk around partnerships, and obviously in Germany there's been a recent deal struck with Deutsche Telekom around base stations, which seem to be moving towards a future which some people predict, which is operators working more closely together to share infrastructure. I mean, is that how you see things working? I mean, you did it in Spain, in Germany. Can you see it in other countries? Is it a way which the industry can use to cut costs and to help develop this?
Well, certainly, and in fact, it's not just happened in Germany. We reached this agreement with Deutsche, with T-Mobile, but in Spain we have been opening our fiber network for wholesale prices with Vodafone or with Orange. It makes no sense not to get some wholesale revenues out of this brand new investment, but it all depends on regulation. So it all depends on what price are you forced to open your network. If it is a commercial agreement or even a retail minus thing, it's okay, but artificially cost-oriented regulation coming from the old copper network makes no sense because those are brand new investments. So in my opinion, the answer is absolutely yes, but it depends on the regulatory framework in which you are forced to do that. So I make this a no-brainer to share more among operators, but it all depends on the framework. And again, it all goes back to the fact that we are thinking with the same mentality from the voice world, and this is a brand new world. I mean, the data world is a brand new, different world. This is not an extension of the former copper network. This is a brand new network. In fact, 4G is the first technology in which data is the core product and voice is a sub-product. So it's full IP network. And the kind of things that you can do with those networks are unthinkable. I mean, this is a brand new, different way of managing networks. Networks can be cognitive, can be proactive, can self-repair themselves. You can virtualize capacity. You can move elements of the network if you have softwareized those parts of the elements. So the way you manage and deploy your networks are totally different. So I think the future is bright for our sector, but it all depends on the framework. And in my opinion, the question that we should ask here in Europe is, what's the Europe we want to have? Do we want to have a Europe with 400 operators? That's fine, but that's not compatible with having an ultra-broadband, state-of-the-art, leading-edge technology, because we are just not competitive on that part. So what's the industrial vision of Europe is the question that we should be asking ourselves.
Yeah. And to the spectrum point, I mean, do you look at Italy and does that sort of fill you with fear?
Well, you look at Italy and you get depressed. You look at the UK, Finland, France, or Spain, and you have the right answers. So in my opinion, we should not just focus on one example, because there are other examples that are going to the right direction. My personal opinion is that, as it has already been said, duration of a spectrum is essential as well. I mean, You cannot re-auction a spectrum every 10 years, 15 years, just to maximize revenues, because this is not an infinite set of resources. So the more you pay for the spectrum, the lower pace you have of deployment. So I think that the industrial policy needs to cope with answers like wholesale pricing, like a spectrum duration, like spectrum pricing, what Europe wants.
Rajeev, I mean, coming to you again, I mean, do you think that Europe does have an industrial policy which is coherent in the sense of, no, it seems to have grand ambitions. At the same time, it doesn't seem to be particularly supportive at the sort of at the bottom level to try and reach those ambitions. I mean, what do you?
I think, for instance, the Accord had some good elements, but it just fell short of so much that could have been done. We just have to allow for consolidation. I mean, look at India. I mean, this notion of, consolidation is anti-competitive and it's bad for consumer prices is a fallacy, because it's always good to be pro-investment, right? So take India as an example. We had 10 operators, now we have 3, and there's 1 government PTT, but 3 private operators. And actually prices haven't gone up. So it's not the fact that if you allow for consolidation that prices are going to go up and so on. There's no evidence of that around the world, sort of even in the case in the US, and that's where they're looking at it now for T-Mobile, Sprint. So no, I don't think we have it. I think that we have talked about the length of the spectrum license. It should be at least about 25 years.
Was it one of the questions that were coming from our audience actually? Is what is the ideal length for 5G spectrum license?
I'd say 25 years plus. Take the example of China. Actually, it doesn't cost.
Yeah.
Because it's industrial policy. We need 5G because underpinning that will be industrial, and robotics and AI and data will be the new oil and everything else. So it doesn't actually cost that much. I think Finland is a good example. 77 million euros for all the licenses. I think a good spectrum is 100 megahertz per operator, 80 to 100 megahertz per operator, and 3.5 gig, the mid-band spectrum, which will be the fuel for 5G. And then there should be some in the millimeter wave. I think Korea just auctioned 100 sort of megahertz in 3.5 gig per operator. One of them might even get 200, and then they gave 800 megahertz in the millimeter wave spectrum, the 28 gig spectrum, and then maybe some low band to allow for massive coverage. I think a good solution is to have all of these 3 as long as possible. 25 years would be awesome. 10 to 15 years is simply not tenable, even if it's low cost. It's not tenable. And the Italy example is, I agree, it's one, but please let's not go back to Italy being a prime example for Europe, because that's what crashed our sector when we used to be number 1 in Europe on everything in wireless, till we ceded that whole thing to the US and Japan and Korea, because look what happened in 2002, 3 around the whole spectrum in various countries.
Yeah. To mention to the audience, in case it wasn't known, that we do have a way of asking questions to the panel via our slido.com app. So please do, has hashtag FTETNO. Just to the point of partnerships and co-investments, I mean, and this goes to regulation as well, because it feels sometimes that the DG Comp and DG Connect and DG, the bits that look after the cars and automotive, they're very siloed. So how can they possibly come up with a regulation which does the connected car, which involves 5G, the car makers, the chip makers? Is the regulation just inherently sort of badly thought out from the start?
Regulation is it's always the constant battle of regulation versus free market. And I come from the view that the free market will solve a lot of the issues. And I think it's the same thing here. We sometimes over-focus on trying to regulate every little detail. Whereas instead, if we start to focus on what is actually the benefit from, for example, a mobile network. So how do we create a strong infrastructure? And I see one of the questions here, for example, is we don't even have basic connectivity with current technology, so why bother about 5G? And that's true, but that's back to the same story, that the operator really needs to be healthy. A healthy operator will invest in technologies. And that cannot be, 400 plus operators in Europe. That is not going to drive investments in an infrastructure. So I think the Commission almost need to take a step back and say, is our role to think that we can predict every regulation that's needed? Or is it better to put some sort of overriding framework in place around competition, but also around stimulating investments? And sometimes I think we almost get, and we ourselves then, we also get into the details about talking about some minute regulation, when we may need to take a step back and say, okay, maybe we should just regulate some sort of basic principles instead.
Yeah.
And that's where I think we in Europe here gets a little bit wrong sometimes. Compare now a little bit with North America. And I went to see Chairman Pai just a few days ago, and you know, the way they are driving, for example, starting a shot clock on how you get site acquisitions, site permitting, how they are cleaning up spectrum now much more aggressively to make mid-band available. Yeah. They're taking a much more, call it, overriding view. And he even took the what I would say was not a very popular decision on net neutrality, but it's critical in order to allow network slicing. Network slicing, how is that going to work in a net neutrality world? I cannot even see that happening.
Because enterprises need different SLAs, and by the very definition.
By definition, right? And I don't want my remote surgery to be downgraded because somebody downloads a video, to be honest. So I think there is a case here that not all traffic is actually created equal. So I think we need to start to look a little bit how others are doing it and maybe adopt a bit.
Yeah. I mean, Cristiano, from your point of view, the US, to some extent, doesn't feel like it has necessarily a very prescriptive industrial policy, so much as to Jose Maria's point, very deregulatory. It has more approach of deregulation. They allow the companies to invest where they want to invest. They can do things like slicing and relax net neutrality. Is that the way forward, a more relaxed approach to things like 5G and the kind of mechanisms around it?
Yeah, you know, maybe I'll answer with a provocative statement, which is it's something you mentioned before. 5G will be the essential network. You know, we don't see it today, but if you look at a mature 4G market today, independence the people have on their smartphones, when you build 5G in its full capacity, you will be touching a number of different industries. And it's very difficult to actually have a very prescriptive regulation for every single industry. Maybe I'll give you just a simple example, maybe something very simple. Today, when we look at our 4G smartphones, the absolute majority of us, we stream music. Like very few people now have a music downloader, you stream music. And the bandwidth of 4G is such that you can have a high quality stream music even at the edge of the cell site. The same thing is going to happen with video and 5G. Everyone will just stream video. So the concept of broadcasting is going to disappear. You don't need for that purpose anymore. Even every other device that has video be streamed video. You have the reliability for news and sports and high quality content. So within that, a lot of regulation for broadcast probably needs to be reassessed. And I think that's going to be true when you go look at automotive, you look at the cars to pedestrian, cars to infrastructure. You're going to look at industrial, healthcare, and many other industries that will be touched from 5G. Once you connect everything to the cloud, through the 5G network, it will be touching so many different industries that even the role, I think, of the service provider becomes, you see service providers going to content, going to other directions as well, because there's going to be a lot more intertwined with the economy. That's why I think maybe a more broad thinking on the role of 5G as a framework for a regulator will probably be important to enable that the technology develop on its full potential and touch all the different industries, which will depend on 5G to remain competitive.
I mean, Jose Maria, I guess the point is that or one of the points is that the regulators seem to have a view of build it and they will come, i.e. put the money into the ground, into the airwaves, and eventually you'll see some money at the end of the rainbow. But do investors and shareholders see that? I mean, clearly they don't want to invest for 20 years. They want to invest for this year, next year, and so on. I mean, when you talk to them, and these are investors who have not necessarily had the best of times in the telecoms industry over the last few years, I mean, what do they say? Are they supportive of the infrastructure plans of the Commission?
Well, investors doesn't look to see the telecom sector like the flavor of the month, to put it bluntly. I mean, this has been one of the worst performing sectors on earth for investors for 2 years in a row. And what they see is that huge capex coming, no monetization of big data explosion, and therefore low returns. And when they talk about 5G, they don't see the user cases, so they don't see the revenue upside. And in terms of the cost opportunity, there is such a need of simplification that also depends on regulation that they are, they're taking a stand. Let's see how it works. In my opinion, this is going to be a massive opportunity, so I'm much more positive. When I roadshow, I try to explain the things that you can do when you deploy a brand new network, like the fiber network we have deployed in Spain, for example, or the things that we are deploying in other places. The amazing opportunities of 4G and then potentially 5G through network slicing, softwareization, virtualization, and things that can be done in terms of simplification and margin expansion. So there is kind of, they are on a wait-and-see mode while you execute. When you execute and you give them some KPIs and some proof points, they tend to believe you. But then they think that the regulators' clock stopped a century ago. So they don't have much expectation on regulation. And I think that's an opportunity. I think that Europe can be, again, the homeland of values of this brand new world. Because it's not just how you design the spectrum auction or how you do the wholesale pricing obligations on these kind of things. Let's take a stand. What's the nature of data? What is data about? Who owns data? Is data valuable for individuals? This kind of debate is also going to change things. And I think that citizens are starting to react. When you see things about concerns rising around privacy, concerns, security, data ownerships, and transparency, I think that on that part, we're on the winning side. So I tend to be much more optimistic than investors. I think that we need to do our homework, simplification, virtualization, being prepared for this margin expansion when you do the right things. For a while, we'll be running several networks in parallel. For example, in Spain, we are running a brand new fiber network and the traditional copper network because for 5 years, you need to pre-advise before decommissioning a central switch. But when you have done your homework, then it's a brand new world in terms of the things that you can do with the network. So I'm much more positive than investors for the time being. I think that investors are on a wait-and-see mode. But I do think that we can convince investors that this is a nice sector to invest in.
Yeah, and certainly once the build out, then it's just, you've got the network and you can hopefully monetize it in the ways we're discussing in terms of the use cases of industrial and consumer. Yeah. Rajeev, we spoke a lot about the US. I know you spend a lot of time in China as well. Obviously, the US has a very deregulation sort of policy. China has almost the opposite. They have a very strong view on authority over there. But they seem to be rolling out 5G at a really rapid pace. I heard some numbers. There's 400 base stations being rolled out every week, 5G base stations in China. Is this right? They're just basically still 4G now. Why are they so in advance, and why are they trying to do this?
Yes, so China, this is all trial activity, but trials in China can be rather big. But the rollouts will actually start in meaningful earnest in, say, Q2, Q3 19. But you're right. I don't think China has a capacity problem with all of the base stations they put out in 4G, so they don't need it for that reason. Latency and industrial opportunity, yes. So they don't have an underlying need. It's not like their networks are overheated, but it's back to the industrial policy. Like, we'll give spectrum free. We'll make sure that we'll be in the first in the world in 5G. Because we're competing with the US. We're competing with big geographies, big countries. And for us, this is underpinning productivity growth and GDP and automation. So I think that's the way they think about it. It's really the China economic industrial policy as opposed to, sort of bottom up. And again, I think you asked this question about, this every industry will have to digitalize and how do we do this? I actually think we need this horizontal digital strategy per country because in 5-7 years' time, whether it's healthcare or utilities or whatever, they'll all have to digitalize and things are going to be common across various things. The second thing, various sectors, and the second thing is let free market forces determine. I think you said it, Börje, but just keep the basic principles because, again, even in car-to-car communication for safety, now I think Europe has picked or is picking Wi-Fi. We would have said, let it be cellular or Wi-Fi. Keep both open and let us decide. Let the market forces determine which is a better outcome. Because I think, of course, the cellular V2X technology is going to be more effective and better, and I think many of the operators believe that as well. But now we've honed in on Wi-Fi. Why not just don't dictate the user what kind of technology? Let free market forces determine consolidation. Let them determine a lot of these things. So we are the most over-regulated geography in the world.
Yeah.
In Europe.
We're running out of time, so I'm just going to go to a couple of questions from the audience, and open to obviously anyone on the panel. But John Strand asks, we have talked about how Europe is falling behind for years. When do you expect Europe will catch up? Do you expect Europe will catch up? I suppose more the point, but...
I think in terms of the 5G timing, I would just say at this point in time, I look at Europe being behind compared to all the countries we talked about. So it's going to be Korea, it's going to be Japan, it's going to be China, it's going to be some Middle Eastern countries. I would even venture to suggest that maybe India could be ahead of Europe in 5G because they are doing in wireless something like 12, 15, 20 gigabytes per month per user on wireless, and in Europe we do a fraction of that. So I would say maybe this time even India could be
It's going to be cheap in India, to be fair.
It is cheap, but do you want to invest in 5G with the low ARPU? It's 2 ARPUs. But I think they might need it because of capacity and the fact the usage is going through the roof.
Yeah.
So it could be very different. Europe could be 2020 or beyond. And by the way, the spectrum isn't available till, I think, end 2020 at the moment. So if you want to do 5G, you need to bring it forward.
I think I think it's not too late to catch up, but it's something that requires very much action across Europe and not have the detailed regulation that we have today. We need to let the market forces drive this. If that happens in Europe, we will see investments. Because that's going to be, we talk about other buzzwords now, artificial intelligence, for example. That's a great thing, but it relies on connectivity. Without connectivity, you can't do a whole lot with AI. It's actually the connectivity that allows you to be leading in AI. So today I hear a lot here in Europe, we should invest in AI. Great, but if we don't have good connectivity, that will be very limited value.
Yeah.
That's where I think China has taken a very different view. China takes the view, this is a national infrastructure, much like the roads, the railroads, the ports. I'm going to build that quickly. And remember, they have 4.5 million base stations in 4G today. I don't know how many we have in Europe. Maybe we have 500,000. I would say. So I mean, they are a factor probably of, call it 5 to 10 in scale what we have. So of course they have a much stronger infrastructure. And now they're going to do the same thing in 5G because that's going to drive automation in factories. It's going to drive artificial intelligence. It's going to drive new applications in healthcare. We need to shape up and take a much more aggressive view on how do we deregulate, how do we create an investment climate that's positive.
Yeah. And Cristiano, just to finish off, could you conclude there?
Yeah, I just want to say, maybe on a bright note, right now we have line of sight. There are a number of markets in Europe that we have now committed, product launch is going to be probably around the same time in the United States in the second quarter of 2019. And I think with the right framework that is pro-investment and enable the operators to be able to invest in this brand new network, we think that Europe can have the scale and catch up. And I wanted to point one thing which is very important. We've seen those things through the years. In the 4G, we saw the development of 2 technologies in parallel. One was you have mobile broadband, and then you have the ability to get computing, personal computing into a smartphone form factor, and that changes the society. If you look, for example, when you go to a simple thing, www.google.com, and you're going to do a search, and as you start to type the keyword, the machine learning started to list for you some of the possible things. So as you connect everything with 5G, and you bring the cloud computing to the edge and to the carrier networks, so you can take advantage of the low latency, artificial intelligence and machine learning will develop side by side with 5G, like we saw computing in 4G. And that's going to be fundamental for the digital economy and for the digital single market. So that's why I think investment in 5G is not an option. It is not optional. And it'll be important, I think, for Europe to remain, competitive. as a continent and to be able to be on par with all the leading economies in the world.
Fantastic. A great moment a great comment to end on, I think, there. And it happens, actually, we have a 5G truck parked outside the conference facility, provided by Huawei. So if anyone hasn't experienced 5G, and I'm certainly among them, I will be outside testing out 5G. I was going to make a joke about 5G speed and trucks, but I don't think you can fill out the punchline from there. It's going to be interesting to see if this develops and how it develops in the next few years. I'm sure we'll be back next year discussing many of these areas. I would like now just a break for the coffee, refreshment period. We'll be back at 11:30. But first of all, can I thank my panel? Thank you so much.
Thank you.